I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thank you for joining us for this introductory lesson on state open meeting laws. As a reminder, all of our classes build off one another. So if you haven't already, please view our previous lessons on open meetings and executive sessions. They'll give you a good overview of the law and lead into what we'll be discussing today. We also have a growing library of lessons on state public record laws and the Federal Freedom of Information Act. All these lessons can be found on our YouTube channel, as well as in our FOI guide at nefac.org/FOI guide. Before we begin this lesson, a special thanks to those helping us make these classes happen. The Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, SPJ New England, the Rhode Island Foundation, and the New England Society of News Editors. We appreciate everyone's support. Now, to introduce you to today's instructor, Emily Sweeney.
Hey everybody, I'm Emily Sweeney from the Boston Globe, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar, which is part of our ongoing series on state open meeting laws. This session is going to focus on citizen participation in government meetings in Maine. And with us is Sig Schutz and Stephen Langsdorf, and they're going to explain the state law on making public comments during open meetings. And they'll also address some common challenges to the public's right to speak at open meetings. And yeah, guys, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Emily.
Well, I'll take it away first, Emily. Thanks again for having us both on. And I'm going to start with the Freedom of Access Act. I know we've had a prior presentation on public meetings, so I'm going to not go into that in great detail, but I will say that the starting point under Maine laws in terms of rights, citizen rights, is whether there's a public proceeding. And this state statute has a definition of public proceeding. Public proceeding is defined in Title I, Section 402, subsection 2 is the transaction of any functions affecting any or all citizens of the state by any of the following. And then the statute lists all sorts of agencies, starting with the legislature and its committees and subcommittees, and then going to any board, commission, agency, authority of any county or municipality or school district or any other political subdivision. So that's what a public proceeding is. And I would sort of frame this discussion about public comment or rights to public comment around what rights the public has and rights the public doesn't have under the Freedom of Access Act. Public has a right to notice under the Act. So the public has a right to reasonable notice of all public proceedings in Maine, including emergency meetings. The public under state law has a right to record, generally a right to record public proceedings under the Freedom of Access Act, subject to reasonable rules and regulations, but a general right to record and film. The public also has a right to attend public proceedings. That's what the public means in public proceedings. But attendance is not the same as participation. So under state law, there's a very broad right to attend with some exceptions, but that does not carry with it the right to participate at the meetings. And I'll just say that, what the bottom line, sort of kind of not to bury the lead, is, well, do members of the public have a right to speak at public meetings under the Freedom of Access Act? And the answer is no. The Act does not require that an opportunity for public participation be provided at open meetings. That said, many public bodies or agencies choose to permit public participation, and Steve Langsdorf, my colleague, can get into that. But strictly speaking, under the state's open meeting law, there is no general right to participate at public meetings. And I just want to touch briefly on remote meetings. The law was amended, Maine law was amended to allow remote participation or remote meetings. When I say remote participation, it's really by members of the board or body itself, not the public. So remote meetings can occur. They're authorized. There are requirements agencies have to go through to permit themselves to have remote meetings. But once again, with remote meetings, there's a right of the public to attend by remote means when members of the body itself are participating remotely. But that doesn't carry with it the right to actually participate in the meetings. Also, for remote meetings, the public's got to be given a right to access materials that the body itself is accessing to the same extent that the members themselves have access to the materials. But that also doesn't mean that members of the public have the right to actually participate at a meeting. Now, again, a body can adopt requirements or permissions or processes for the public to participate, but that's just not required either for traditional in-person meetings or for newly authorized meetings by Zoom or social media or other means.
I just want to jump in on one point there regarding public meetings and particularly regarding executive sessions, because as everyone's well aware, there are a number of areas under the law where a government body is allowed to have an executive session. And as long as that's for a proper purpose, of course, then no public participation is allowed. But there is a process where the motion to go into executive session has to be stated with particularity. And that's quite a subjective standard because there are different sections under the law, and some boards may say we're going in to discuss litigation, but it's actually proper for a member of the public to ask, could you please specify more why you're going to executive session? What case is it that you're going in to discuss, and so forth? And so while you can't go in, you can at least flesh out the whole concept of whether or not it's proper to go into executive session. And there are times where it isn't, and it also still requires a 3/5 vote of the body. It's more than a simple majority to go in executive session. So there are times when a body wants to go in executive session and it may or may not be proper, and you can generate some discussion and potentially keep that as a public matter, if handled properly. So I just wanted to add that to what Sig was saying.
I mean, often will a board recognize a member of the public? I mean, how should someone state, I don't know if it's an objection, but it is in the nature sort of an objection, a question, gee, can you be more specific about the nature of this executive session? Is it, raise your hand? Is it just stand up and be heard?
Yeah, raise your hand. Often most public meetings will have some designated microphone or place for people to go to if they have something to say. And, we do this, we see this in meetings by participants in both the audience and on the boards itself, and in effect asking for a point of order and say, is this proper to go in executive session? I don't understand. It's not with any specificity and so forth. And even along those lines, and kind of a similar point that I've seen made before is, generally, as we know, a chair of a meeting is going to be the person who runs that meeting for the most part, making decisions about how some matters, are being handled. But it is, it's not necessarily required that that chair be the final arbiter of those types of decisions. So if the chair may be acting in a way that you sense the rest of the committee or council, whoever it is, doesn't agree, it's also, again, to ask for a point of order. Can we ask for a vote of the body itself as to whether or not you agree with the position being taken with the chair at this time? And that's a proper thing to do as well if you think there might be some limitations that you're not expecting. But just
don't
follow
get
up
yourself
on
arrested either.
exactly. You want to try to avoid that. Well, Sig kind of said to set the stage for this a little, in terms of what happens in Maine, which is, where we all know that all politics are local, all public participation is really local in Maine. And so I just to know who I am, I've been representing municipalities in Maine now for over 30 years. I've been the corporation counsel to the city of Augusta and a number of other municipalities. I've been in Augusta for more than 25 years, which is approximately how long Sig's been an attorney at Preti Flaherty. And when he first came on, we had a very strong history of representing the media, news organizations, and Gannett and others throughout the years. And I think we all anticipated that there could be a sort of a culture clash between, how media would look at these types of issues and how municipalities may look at, freedom of access types of issues. But really, that clash doesn't exist. And Sig and I both feel very strongly that we want to just give good advice as to how to handle these issues. We don't try to have a slant for the municipalities or a slant, for the press. We really try to give the right answer and be very objective at and fair. It's not my job. I certainly don't see how my job being to restrict public access in any way. There's a question that's come up in the chat, which is a good one, which is, is it proper in effect to be limiting public participation to residents of a particular municipality? And it is not proper to do that. If you're going to allow public participation, I mean, you may have, if there's a time concern, you know, it may be proper to say we're going to hear residents first, and then we'll move on, you know, to non-residents thereafter. And a sort of ancillary questions come up, which I've never seen questioned, but a question was, you know, every time I see public participation, someone is asked to identify themselves. And so we were practicing for this. The question is, well, what happens if someone refuses to? Great question. I haven't seen it happen. We've never required people sort of say why they're speaking or on whose behalf, just sort of who are you? You know, kind of a thing seems to be a general acceptable requirement. So in Maine, the only statute that I could find that, other than statutes where you have a required public hearing process, which is required under a number of types of development permits and grants, and so forth, is a statute under the school department statutes under Title 20A. And Title 20A does specifically state that a school board shall provide the opportunity for the public to comment on school and education matters at a school board meeting. Nothing in this section restricts the school board from establishing reasonable standards for the public comment period, including time limits and conduct standards. And then it goes on to say the school board meeting means a full meeting of the board, but does not apply necessarily to subcommittees or smaller groups. So there is a statutory right to participate. And the way that this works, and it's really the same situation whether you have a school department or whether it's a planning board or it's any particular subdivision of a municipality or county or whoever it may be. They set their own rules and regulations and policies as to how public comment is handled. For the most part, again, while it's not required, I've never seen bodies that completely disallow public comment. It's just, it doesn't happen. But how it's restricted, of course, we know that for freedom of speech, we have time, place, and manner restrictions, and we have to be fair, and we have to make sure that everybody is getting a reasonably equal opportunity to present their points of view. A lot of times what we'll see, for example, at planning board meetings are, please tell us if you're for, against, or neutral with your comments, and then they sort of get a sense of the timing and so forth. And we're not really going to get into this today at all, but the standards for participation at a planning board meeting or at a quasi-judicial type of process when it's an actual application or hearing type of process is, of course, different from your general public participation process at a meeting, because you have a particular vested interest in that process as an abutter or and so forth. And so I'm not really talking here about how to deal with public participation at those types of quasi-judicial types of proceeding. It's really more along the lines of just general comment, public comment, and so forth. I'll give an example. For example, in Augusta, as I said, where I've been the attorney, we have every other week, we have informational meetings of the council. And then those are more informal opportunities where business is not generally conducted, but there is an agenda which lists a number of public issues. And there's also a formal process for asking, making requests to appear, to be able to comment before, and also open comment period. And so what happened was at these meetings, and according to a procedure we'd set up by ordinance, sort of the comment period and the open public comment period were scheduled to be at the end of the meetings. And so there was a request made to say, you know, that's really restricting public comment, because a lot of times these meetings are very long and it goes late into the evening and people don't want to stick around and wait for that. And so we took it up at the council level, and the council voted to change the ordinance and allow the public comment to go first. So, I mean, just things like that in general. If you're not satisfied with the way that public comment is being handled anywhere, whether that's a board of selectmen meeting, a council, and so forth, it's absolutely appropriate to be sort of lobbying to change those rules. These boards generally set their own rules. Most of the time, the municipality is not setting those types of rules for its subordinate board. So it's really down to the most grassroots basics here to be able to say, we're unhappy with the way that public comment is being handled. Could you move it up in the meeting? Could you make it longer, and so forth? I did look up, and there was a very, very good policy that I found online for a particular school district, which I started sort of looking through to look at the types of concerns that are identified in public participation policies. And the one that I read, which was for MSAD 75, which is in the Topsom area, has a very reasonable sort of set of rules where they're very much encouraging people to participate, but then kind of goes through the gamut of saying that the chair may limit the time allotted for comments. If there's a sizable audience, they may ask people to sign up to be able to speak so they can be called on in a fair and efficient manner. The chair is supposed to recognize speakers, and they have to identify themselves. And generally speaking, with these rules, that all bodies will ask that you speak directly to the chair, that you don't turn around, even though your audience and who you're speaking to may be the people who are in the audience. That the sort of the protocol is that you should be talking to the chair and to the body itself. And there's other things in here. You're like, you're not supposed to share gossip or make personal comments or use vulgar language. You shouldn't be directing attack speeches on anyone based on anything about their protected categories. In other words, and generally speaking, it is proper, for a board to then, if you're volunteering to get up and speak and ask questions, it's proper for that board to ask you questions as well. You have to answer those questions, but it's proper for a board to ask. And of course, you have to stay out of particular personnel matters and things like getting up and saying such and such a teacher is awful and these kinds of things. It's proper to restrict, but generally matters of public interest according to some reasonable protocol is entirely proper and really just set up on a local level by each board. So that's really kind of the general idea of how things work in Maine. I did say there are a number of areas where there are very specific requirements for public hearings, and clearly at those public hearings is an open opportunity for people to make comments subjected to rules as well. If you have a community development block grant, we could think of many other examples where public hearings are actually written into the law. And so this is kind of generally how things work. I'm happy to answer questions, or if you have something else to jump in on here, Sig, or anything from you, Emily.
Well, I was just going to say, the other way in public participation, of course, is in writing. So, I mean, that's always an alternative. And if there's a question up front about what a particular board is likely to permit, the clerk, the chair, I mean, who would be the best person to ask, Steve? For clarification. So it would be,
usually the chair, or if there's a particular staff member from the municipality who, like a planning board, will have one of the people from the code enforcement office who sort of staffs the meeting. And that's generally a good person to talk to about those kinds of things from the get-go.
And then, I think for certain matters, I think the answer you gave was no, a municipality shouldn't be limiting comment only to, residents. But it is common for the protocol in a lot of towns for people to identify themselves and where they live, in part just because that gives a little bit more kind of oomph to their comments. If they're a local resident in a particular counselor's district, it's significant. Or if they're a local resident who may be adjacent to the project, or who may be affected by whatever's going on, that may be important for the body to know, versus someone who doesn't have as direct an interest, let's say, in a particular issue. But for some matters, it may be important to identify who you are and who you represent if you're there in a representative capacity. And if you are representing someone or a group of neighbors, or if your attorney's there, it is important for the person to identify who they're speaking on behalf of, for the record, and that could be important for legal reasons. And I was just going to say the other category of participation relates to adjudicative matters, or where there may be issues of whether a person has standing, or where a participant is proposing a particular project and then has a right to be heard for due process and other reasons on their particular project. And there's a smaller group or smaller universe of people who are likely to be given standing to participate in a more meaningful substantive matter, depending on the nature of the permit or license or application or project that may be under consideration, particularly if it's a land use matter.
Yeah, I just saw a question about accommodations, and I'll respond to that by saying it's something that many, obviously, the larger town, the better it's going to have accommodations that are built in. But I would say just that if you particularly need some sort of accommodation to be able to communicate, you should definitely do that as soon as possible in terms of making the government body know. And then, yes, they would be responsible for providing that type of accommodation if that accommodation is requested, in advance, obviously giving reasonable time and so forth. But that does become the municipality's responsibility if a reasonable accommodation is requested for communications with that body.
And I know you guys did touch on this during the discussion, but I just want to throw this out there. Are there any other tips, that you could have for the public or journalists who feel that their rights might not be, maybe their voice isn't being heard at meetings? Is there any recourse they can take, or?
Well, I think obviously there's never anything that's wrong with meeting with people or sort of just starting to express your concern and in a productive type of way. Okay. So basically, if I had a concern, I would try to find the right person to talk to in that municipality, and it's perfectly fine to be a reporter. For example, where I say work the most in Augusta, we've had a very open relationship with the reporter covering the meetings. We provide him an email with a copy of the council packets at the same time that they go, to the council. And when he's had concerns, we talk to him about that. It, depends what it is, how much impact it has, kind of like Sig was talking about. If a citizen wants something and it's someone's constituent, they might be more influential. It's hard to say, but I think for the most part, I haven't heard about a lot of places that want to be unfair with the way that they provide comments and so forth. Of course, they don't want meetings to go on for 3 or 4 hours, either. But I think if you have a concern, just sort of look for the right source. And it could be as simple as just talking to someone about how they're handling things, and they might adjust things. Or it might mean that you need to go through more of a process of saying, can we work on a process to try to change these rules? Because planning board can do that. They can have workshops. You can participate in those workshops. Sometimes workshops are areas where boards kind of don't let people participate, but you still have the right to at least be there and listen to the process. They have to be done in public. I
think this has been really enlightening, and I appreciate you guys, Sig, Steve, for taking the time to explain some of this, especially how it pertains to Maine, particularly. So
we're happy to do that, Emily. And obviously, any follow-up questions or something, you can always get a hold of us. We're easy to find, and happy to do this today. Glad it was helpful.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, hey, thanks everybody. Thanks for everybody for tuning in too. All right.
Take care.
Take care.